Many thanks to Jane and Rachel for inviting me here, at least virtually, to continue thinking through issues which I know are of concern to both Engage and GEM, about how the day-to-day working of engagement relates to the big picture of museum visitation. I'd like to start with the big statistic, which is not really acknowledged in any of the many recent books about audience development and community engagement, including Nina Simon's, or in any UK policy document. If you look at the data for England, museum visiting by all social groups has increased since taking part surveys began in 2007. What has not changed, however, is the gap in attendance between upper and lower socioeconomic groups. This has remained remarkably stable at about 34 percentage points. It looks like everything we are doing, improving exhibitions, creating better facilities, uh, more communicative marketing, professionalizing customer care, more evidence-based learning and engagement practices, the recent development of health and well-being activities. These are just about enabling us to keep up with wider social change. The 34% gap is, of course, an average, and some museums do better, some do a lot worse. But it looks like even the most inclusive have not been able to reduce the gap in museum visiting between upper and lower socioeconomic groups. At this point, I feel I should set out some of my credentials to assure you my commitment to engagement work. When I was head of Glasgow Museums in the early 2000s, and we were rebuilding the service after drastic cuts, we prioritised learning and engagement, greatly increasing the staff numbers, including those of the Open Museum, our award-winning outreach service. Apart from a few London nationals, Glasgow had the largest learning and engagement team of any museum in the UK, at least up to the onset of austerity. Like many of you, I have personal experience of the value to individuals and groups who've been whose lives have been clearly greatly enriched by their participation. However, towards the end of my time in Glasgow, I began to wonder if there was a missing link between this kind of work and our overall failure to reduce the attendance gap. If you look at the research about the demographic characteristics that predict museum visiting, the most important factor is not class, race, ethnicity, or income, but it is level of educational attainment. These factors all, of course, have an effect and interact, but the primacy of education seems to me to be especially important, as many, if not most, museums were founded as educational institutions. I'm assuming here that public education is a good thing, that it supports human development, and is not, or at least not only, is not a form of middle-class cultural domination. In these terms, what the attendance gap shows is that museums are not, in fact, institutions of public education. They superserve the already educated. It also means that the people who could benefit most from the educational impact of museums are those who are least likely to visit. This is often seen as a problem of funding. Funding is indeed an issue, not only because there is too little, but because a great deal of it is short-term. Some of museums' best work with the most vulnerable people in our society is based on marginal funding for marginal projects. But research in Germany, which has the richest arts and culture sector in Europe, if not in the world, has shown that all the activities we would summarize under the heading of audience development have not changed the composition of cultural audiences, including those of museums. So, what does this imply for museums that want to be more inclusive? If our current audience development and engagement activities have not reduced the attendance gap up to now, it seems unlikely that they will do so in the future. I'm not really sure what the answer is, but I will risk a suggestion, as doing more of the same seems to be a recipe for continued failure. My suggestion is based on two assumptions. First, that in many museums, engagement is a semi-detached process, which is often used to protect what is seen as the traditional core of the museum from real change. Second, that learning, engagement, outreach, and co-production activities are too focused on their immediate outcomes and on the search for evidence about these outcomes and do not have a real strategic purpose. We want school groups to learn about the Romans or the Victorians. We want to reduce the isolation of the elderly group to improve the well-being of the mental health group. But we have no way of linking these activities to the large-scale picture. I suspect that museums could never do enough of this intensive working with small groups as it is currently organized to modify the attendance gap. What then is the alternative? My suggestion is based on the research in museums and well-being, not by those who study activity programs, but by epidemiologists who study the statistics about long-term health and well-being and the links with cultural and in particular museum attendance. These studies involve very large numbers of people over decades, and they're controlled for income, education, gender, chronic illness, and age. The sophisticated statistical methods used support with a high degree of confidence the direction of causation. In other words, it's not that healthier people visit museums more often, but that visiting museums regularly makes you healthier. And regularly in this context means 3 or more times a year. This effect is very like the impact of exercise. You lose the benefit if you stop, you can regain it if you start again, and it's never too late to start. This evidence seems to me much more robust than a lot of the evidence from individual projects, where confirmation bias is hard to avoid and it's extremely difficult to do long-term follow-up. There are likely to be real benefits from these activities, but it's also likely that these benefits will fade as people re-enter their own lives with all the accompanying pressures. And the numbers are too small to make a difference at a population level. So the 6 steps in my argument are as follows. 1. While museum engagement may have life-enhancing impacts on some individuals' learning or well-being, the single most strategic contribution museum activities of all kinds could make is building the lifelong capacity amongst people who are poorly educated or socially excluded for other reasons to become regular museum visitors. 2. All engagement and learning activities, whatever their specific focus, should have a meta-objective of building the museum visiting capability of not only the participants in any given project, but their wider networks of family, friends, and community. It might be clearer if I take a very familiar example, that of school visits. There is some evidence that children benefit educationally from school visits, but very little that school visits predict adult visiting later in life. Museum visiting is learned in the family setting. So, while teachers will still want curriculum relevant subjects, the museum's meta objective of getting the children to bring their families back can drive the format. For example, every child learns about the Romans or the Victorians by conducting a tour that they would give to a person of their choice when they visit on their own. Students from schools in deprived areas can be incentivized or supported to visit in their own time with vouchers for free entry, for the cafe, or for activities. 3. These principles would need to be systematically applied in the long term to every kind of activity and engagement. A well-being project for 10 or 20 people will have much less impact than a project which inspires 100 or 200 people to become regular museum visitors. There would need to be a lot of trial and error to figure out what works, but there would be a strategic purpose that would focus the learning. 4. Deepening and extending current processes of engagement and co-production will be essential to make our museums welcoming and attractive to these new visitors. 5. The aim of reducing the attendance gap will shift engagement from being a way of avoiding change to being a driver of long-term transformation. 6. And finally, as far as I can see, focusing the majority of museum activities on building long-term museum visiting capabilities amongst non-visiting lower socioeconomic groups is the only way we are likely to achieve a reduction in the attendance gap. Thank you very much.